for NC Stop Human Trafficking. And just a little bit about, welcome to labor trafficking in the U.S., by the way. This is our first time doing this, as Pam said, and I'm very excited to be able to do it. And the reason I'm excited is because my first encounter with even the idea of human trafficking was through labor trafficking. So I'm glad I get to tell these stories. But a little bit about myself. I was a journalist for about 7 years in North Carolina. And in those 7 years, I came across victims of labor trafficking when I was doing investigative work in 2014. I then transitioned to advocacy, is what you see me here today. I have been doing this, I've been in this position for 2 years this month, and I'm so excited to be here. I'm also so excited to be in my office again. It's been 3 months since I've been in that one, so I'm very happy. So a little bit about, you'll learn a lot about what I did learn in the fields in 2014, but first I want to talk about NC Stop Human Trafficking. So there's a lot of confusion around human trafficking in general, and that's why it's important to have organizations like NC Stop Human Trafficking, because what we do is we educate. The power in this is to equip community members, service providers, professionals to identify a possible human trafficking victim and make the appropriate referral, whether that's calling the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-3737-888 and reporting the suspicions, or if you're a community member, or being a capable professional in a professional setting to communicate effectively with a possible survivor. And we also work to improve victim response and human trafficking investigations. And education is really important because you don't know what you don't know. And this organization is here to fill that knowledge gap, which is very, very important. And when we go into a bit about labor trafficking in the United States, you're going to understand why it is so important to fill that knowledge gap, which is why I'm glad you're here. We also collaborate with other organizations across the state and locally. Human trafficking is a multifaceted issue, and that's why collaboration is necessary. It's necessary for adequate victim response, and it's necessary for effective prevention programming. We work on developing coalitions. Right now, we are working in the eastern part of the state, and Pam could speak more to that if you had questions. And in the eastern part of the state, it's more rural with limited resources, which really bolsters the importance of what a coalition. And we founded the Pitt County Coalition Against Human Trafficking, which is our oldest and most robust coalition thus far. If you want to know more about the Pitt County Coalition Against Human Trafficking, you can go to pccaht.org, or pcat.org as we call it. We also advocate for stronger anti-human trafficking legislation in the state and in the nation. Change begins with sound policies. And when we look at policy, we're looking for stronger penalties for traffickers, more compassionate programs for victims, and more funding and more education around the issue of human trafficking. Later in this presentation, you will see how policy has made people vulnerable to labor trafficking. So that's what I mean when I say sound policy is a good avenue for changing the whole system that maybe could facilitate human trafficking. We'll just talk about that a little bit later, though. We also introduce fair trade products into the local markets. Fair trade principles deter human trafficking globally and locally by reducing the demand for exploited labor and bolstering protective factors for the entire communities to prevent human trafficking. We put our money where our mouth is as an organization, and so we support many fair trade certified companies by selling the fair trade ourselves, and the money we make from our fair trade sales goes to our community programming like this webinar. We are a small nonprofit, and it's a great social enterprise, but it's also a great avenue for change, especially when you're talking about anti-human trafficking. You'll find at the end of this discussion, demanding fair trade certification and fair labor practices as a consumer is where businesses change how they treat their employees, and that is very important. As people, we have a voice, and sometimes our voice is our money, and how we spend our money matters. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about fair trade certification and fair trade principles. So today, we're going to be looking at the top 3 industries in the United States that have labor trafficking issues. I'm not saying that everybody working in those industries are being trafficked for labor. I'm saying these are the top 3, the top 3 industries that have reports of human trafficking or labor trafficking to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Those industries on a national level are agriculture, domestic work, and traveling sales crews. And bear in mind, simply the top 3 industries in the United States, according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline numbers. If we expand our scope, which we don't have the time to really do today because that would take hours and hours and hours, but if we did, the top 5 in the nation would be the restaurant industry or food service industry, illicit massage businesses, or illicit activities like strip clubs would also be included on the national numbers. We would also look at construction. There are actually 25 industries that have labor trafficking involvement. But today we're only going to look at the top 3 in the country. I just wanted to add that caveat. There's so much more we could talk about when we're talking about labor trafficking. However, if you're tuning in from North Carolina, which I saw some people were, the top industries where labor trafficking is prevalent is, I'm sure if you're in North Carolina, you know this probably already, it's agriculture, domestic work, restaurant work, and construction and traveling sales crews. So this presentation not only applies to the nation, but also to the state. Of course, all these industries, the numbers that are coming from this are from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And we recently did a newsletter, I don't know if you've received it, about the National Human Trafficking Hotline report and numbers. Just so you know that those numbers are not the end all and the be all. These are just the people that report to this one place. We're not talking about service providers. We're not talking about law enforcement investigations. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this. We're going to talk about the systems that are set up to facilitate labor trafficking in these industries. And trust me, there are systems that are set up to make people more vulnerable or don't offer protections for the people in these industries. Those systems might include lack of oversight, cultural acceptance, and lack of protections. And we'll go into that a little bit later. Of course, I'm not going to leave you hopeless. At the end, we're going to talk about the things that you can do to help this issue, and some good ideas about what you can do to help. And with that being said, I want to go ahead and get started. So what is labor trafficking? Well, this definition is a legal definition, but I always like to say this means compelling somebody. You'll get the PDF of these slides, by the way, but this means compelling somebody to work using force, fraud, or coercion. And the limitation of identifying labor trafficking is pretty broad, because like working is a part of someone's everyday life. Typically, when somebody's working, we don't think maybe they're being forced to work, you know. So not only does the confusion result in the general public not really seeing labor trafficking victims, it's also very hard to be investigated by law enforcement officers. We'll see that many victims were only able to get some kind of justice through civil actions, and that'll be apparent in this presentation. And it's hard to investigate just being employed, like what appears to be employment. So there are also, depending on the industry, entanglements in immigration issues and other illegal activities. Also, labor trafficking isn't mutually exclusive. Somebody can be trafficked for labor, and somebody can also be trafficked for sex at the same time. And in my experience, in my work as in the fields, sexual assault was pretty common. Not like as far as stories I was told anyway. I can't really give you any kind of numbers on that, but so labor trafficking, my point is labor trafficking doesn't occur in a vacuum. And there are a lot of intersections going on here. There are many things that lead people to being vulnerable to being trafficked for labor. And one of those reasons, one of those things is substance use issues, which will be in something that we talk about in traveling sales crews for sure, for certain. But with that, before we get started on the industries, anybody have any questions?
I don't see any, Melinda.
Okay, well, we'll just keep on going then. So the industries that we're going to be talking about again are agriculture, domestic work, and traveling sales crews. And we're going to get started in agriculture. Human trafficking among migrant farm workers is largely misunderstood, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why that is a little later. But right now, I want you to meet Mr. Garcia. And I met Mr. Garcia in 2014. He came to America in search of a better life in 2009. He needed to find more work than Guatemala had to offer, so he came here from, he was an undocumented worker in 2014, and he paid a smuggler $7,500 to get him across the border, and that's money he got from putting a lien on his home in Guatemala. He pays back that loan with interest as of 2014, and if he got here in 2009 and he was still talking about that loan in 2014, you're kind of left wondering, how has it taken him this long to pay off a $7,000 loan? Just so you understand what we're talking about here. He lived in the Wayne County area in eastern North Carolina, and he worked in tobacco fields. In June of 2014, which is the month I met him, he lost part of his finger on his right hand in a mechanical tobacco harvester, and his finger got caught in the pulley. It took an hour of waiting in the fields, bleeding, while he waiting for a ride to the hospital. The overseer he was working with or working for didn't want to take him, but eventually agreed to. Mr. Garcia doesn't really know how much he got paid as of 2014. He says he was promised $8 an hour, but the numbers really don't add up for him, and he can't really check because he didn't get a pay stub. He only gets paid in cash. He has to pay rent, about $25 a week, for a single ride trailer that he shares with 4 other men. And there are beds in every room in the single wide trailer, so I'm thinking that there are more men that live there, but I don't really know for sure. So that rent was deducted from his check, as well as his taxes. But he can't tell you really what his deductions are. He wasn't able to make any money while he was recovering from his injury, and the boss didn't pay his medical expenses. He didn't have workers' compensation, of course. And while he's out of work, so does his debt to the labor contractor who he has to pay rent to, as well as the people in Guatemala who has a lien on his home. With that, that's a pretty intense story, and that was an actual story that was told to me in 2014 when I was working as a journalist in the fields doing an investigative report. Later, you'll see what actually happened in this story and why there is so much confusion around the agricultural industry work. And it was very prevalent in my talks with the editors and trying to get the story published, which ultimately didn't happen. So let's look at some red flags of Mr. Garcia's story. Would anybody like to share what they think some red flags were? Even though I already have the slide up. So there was a lien on his home to get smuggled here. He was here. He was an undocumented worker as of 2014. And we're going to go into a little bit more about the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. That definitely gets conflated. He had no way to leave because no one was going to take him anywhere. And he couldn't even get a ride to the hospital. And even if he did want to go back to Guatemala, he had a lien on his home and he couldn't pay that lien off without work. And that really kept him here. I remember very specifically, he said, "I just want to go home, but I cannot." And so when you see the person's not the person doesn't have the ability to leave the situation is a huge red flag in human trafficking and labor trafficking. If they can't leave, then that's that's entrapment. That's keeping a person in the job. Which brings me to my next point. After 5 years of taking out a small loan, he was still paying it off. The likelihood that he would be able to pay it off, considering he wasn't getting paid what he was promised, and he doesn't even know what his deductions are, and he doesn't really know how much he's paying in rent, because those deductions aren't obvious to him. It will be a hard time for him to pay off that lien, and they were not paying him, he doesn't think, to what they promised. So those are all red flags of labor trafficking on Mr. Garcia's story. I'm trying to move the slides over, but I'm really struggling here. Okay, here we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. The story of this story, I'm going to share another story with you about another man who came to the United States and he was smuggled here. It was one of the most harrowing kind of human smuggling stories I've heard, but it is not uncommon. He's been in the U.S. As of 2014, he had been in the U.S. for 10 years. And he was okay with the other places he had been working, because he was a migrant farm worker, so he'd go all the way up to New Jersey and work in Georgia and work in Florida. It was in North Carolina where it was particularly abusive. But his story, out of fear of deportation, I'm not going to tell you this man's name, but he came to the U.S. in 2005 under precarious circumstances, crossing the Mexican desert over 14 days. He paid a coyote to do that. He worked in Georgia, Florida, New Jersey, and he came into North Carolina in 2014, the year I met him, with a promise of only having to work 3 weeks and then returning to New Jersey. That plan didn't pan out. According to him, he didn't get to go back because there was no work in New Jersey, so he stayed in North Carolina. I did this outreach stuff, this journalism, this project with the Farm Laborers Organization Committee and out of Dudley, the office in Dudley. They invited me just to meet men who were agricultural workers, and I was very excited to do that. So an intern with FLOC, or the Farm Laborers Organization Committee, who escorted me to the camps, had told me briefly about the camp and how the camp treated the workers at that time in 2014, of course. She said that his living conditions were dire, and the overseer or foreman that undocumented workers were employed with is believed to abuse the workers physically, and that's what she said at the time. She said she went to the camp, and many of them told her that if they didn't work fast enough, the contratista, which is what they call the labor contractor, would hit them. There was one day that because they didn't work fast enough, the contratista left them at a gas station, and it took them 9 hours to get back to the camp. And you're going to see that is also abandonment is also common in traveling sales crews, but we're not going to talk about that just yet. The man who I talked to corroborated that story. He lives in the camp. There's no hot water. There was no hot water in the women's bathroom, no doors for any of the bathroom stalls. The sleeping quarters were an open room in a concrete barn, and that 10 people would occupy. His pay stubs, which he did get pay stubs, were scrawled on what looked like scraps of paper, and you couldn't read them. He's not sure how much he makes. So with that being said, a little bit about human trafficking, the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. And it is really important that you understand the difference between the two. Human smuggling is a crime against a country where somebody is illegally crosses a border. Human trafficking is a crime against a person. Human trafficking is compelling somebody to work using force, fraud, or coercion, or compelling somebody to perform a commercial sex act using force, fraud, or coercion. And that definition changes when you're talking about sex trafficking anyway, under if the person's under 18. But now the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling isn't really delineated in our common and how we're talking about it, and it really should be. If you do get into the country, through smuggling, you're more vulnerable to being trafficked, but that doesn't make you a traffic victim. But you are more vulnerable to being trafficked, just so we're all clear. Does anybody have any questions about human trafficking and human smuggling before I go on? Shoot. Sorry.
I don't see any questions.
Okay, I didn't mean to stop the share. So with that, we talked about undocumented agricultural workers, and now I want to talk about people who are legally here and should have protections being trafficked in agriculture. So Legal Aid of North Carolina was successful at getting a $75,000 settlement for these 13 migrant farm workers who were here in the United States completely legally. We're going to talk a little bit about, guest worker visas a little later, but I want to stress that they were here with guest worker visas and are supposed to be granted the rights that they should have. But anyway, the workers were recruited from Mexico by 3 labor contractors using the H-2A guest worker visa program. The H-2As are specific to agricultural workers. And we'll go through how immigration and guest worker laws are inherently exploitative if they're abused. But right now, they were here in the country legally. It was the labor contractors who exploited their vulnerabilities of not being familiar with their rights or this country. Farm labor contractors recruit, transport, oversee, and often house workers on behalf of agricultural companies. The reality that these workers were met with was a stark difference about what they were promised in Mexico. It was painted as a job opportunity and something that they can make money at, and it's a good opportunity for them to take. Well, the labor contractors charged them recruitment fees, which under the H-2A guest worker visa program is prohibited. They failed to pay required hourly wages. If you're here under a guest worker program, you're required to make a certain amount of money. They lied about the chances of them getting to stay in the country. They failed to reimburse the workers' the visa and travel expenses to come from Mexico to North Carolina. That's a guarantee under the program. They house them in substandard housing, which is some housing that I just kind of talked about a little bit earlier with the undocumented workers. They were deprived of workers' compensation coverage. They were impeded access to medical care, and the labor contractors kept their social security cards and their passports. When workers asked for their wages, they were threatened. So the attorney from Legal Aid, and she's also a member of the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission, Caitlin Rowland, she's amazing. She said, this is what in the news coverage, and I think in the NC, the Legal Aid of North Carolina press release about the winning the settlement, she said, this is what labor trafficking looks like. Sex trafficking might be better known, but labor trafficking is just as pernicious, and it's all too prevalent, especially in industries where labor contractor services are used. In the agricultural industry, labor contractor services are used heavily, and I think that's getting kind of reducing now or decreasing, but still it's used heavily. And it's usually the labor contractors that are the traffickers. They're like the middleman, you know. So according to the settlement, the labor contractors agreed to pay $75,000 to 13 farm workers, which if you divide that up by 13 isn't a lot, I don't think anyway, for what they had to go through. But all the contractors also received a lifelong bans from participating in the H-2A program. So we're going to go through the red flags of this. Does anybody want to, share in the chat box what they think the red flags were? And while you're doing that, I'll just go ahead and click to it. So the red flags of this, because they were here under guest worker visas, they were charged unlawful recruitment fees. Workers didn't get what they were promised. They were subjected to threats, coercive manipulation to keep working, and their passports were confiscated. A big red flag in all human trafficking is the confiscation of passports or identification documents. And not just for labor trafficking, or people who come in from other foreign nationals. It's across the board. When we start talking about traveling sales crews, I'm going to talk a lot about how they confiscate identification information from the victims. So with that, we are going to move on into, well, why farm workers are so vulnerable. Their lack of viable options. If you look at Mr. Garcia's story, what were his options? He couldn't go back home. He couldn't leave. Where was he going to go? Not understanding the language or the rights. Lack of opportunity. Fear of deportation, which is absolutely heightened right now. And current attitudes toward immigrants from Mexico and South American countries. These are all barriers for farm workers to come forward, and all barriers for and keeps them in a traffic situation. So with that, I think I'm going to pause for some questions. Does anybody have any?
So Melinda, Annabelle asked, do undocumented people have legal rights if they are being trafficked?
That is a very good question, Annabelle. And the Trafficking Victims Protection Act does set up legal rights, and those rights are their ability to get a T visa or a trafficking visa, which offers them a legal avenue for employment and to stay here legally, and opens up opportunity for them. Those T visas are still being given now currently. It's a little bit harder to get a T visa now, but under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, they are afforded those that right to get one if they can prove they've been trafficked.
If I could just add, it does take a while to get a T visa, and so in the meantime, until you get that, basically you are not to be deported while that process is going through. So yes, there are some rights that are afforded. Typically, the person has to agree to cooperate with law enforcement. And cooperation doesn't always mean, yes, I'll testify in court. It may be that they'll just provide information about the situation. But so in order to get these rights, so to speak, and to move forward with applying for a T visa, then law enforcement has to certify them and certify that they are willing to be helpful. But that's a great question. And I see someone's asking, how do they prove they're being trafficked? So the criteria that Melinda mentioned are, is force, fraud, or coercion. And so there has to be evidence of that. And it is, frankly, it's harder right now to get a T visa than it has been in several years. And the thing that is really scary about the way that that program is being administered right now is if a person is denied a T visa, then deportation is most likely to immediately be started. The deportation procedure is going to be started. So that makes victims less likely to apply for a T visa, because if they are denied, they're going to be deported. So when you talk about, the system being against victims, then certainly this is a really good example of that.
And a little nugget on that, the denials for T visas are up and approvals are down, and pending statuses on T visas are as the highest they have ever been. So it is definitely a struggle currently for victims to acquire those T visas. But thank you for your questions. After that, well, the next industry we're going to talk about is domestic work. Well, I've talked a lot about agriculture, and it is the #1 industry in North Carolina for labor trafficking. the actual #1 industry in the nation is domestic work. So we're going to go to a case here. 3 Indonesian women filed a lawsuit against a wealthy businessman for fraudulently luring them to the U.S. to serve as nannies. The family took the women's passports, threatened them and did other psychological abuse to keep the women from leaving. They were not paid fairly, though they were convinced to come to the U.S. with promises of good wages and working conditions. When they arrived in LA, because that's where this case is, or it was, the women were forced to do manual labor and required to work 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. They made them believe that they would be put in jail if they reached out to police or a stranger for help. They used their work contract as leverage, because these women did sign a contract, and had people intimidate their family and friends who were in LA and in Indonesia. One woman eventually escaped and got help for the remaining 2, and as of this one, which was also in 2014, I believe, the people were getting sued. It was a civil case. They were also arrested for human trafficking as well. But we're going to go into how these arrests, when they may be arrested, but sometimes it doesn't pan out. So with that, again, let's talk a little bit about those red flags. What are you seeing here for the red flags? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat box. Yes, they did have disabilities. But they were still required to work in grueling manual labor. So that's ours, yes. So some of the red flags here were, that's right, confiscated passports. Again, these are, that is one big red flag when you're talking about trafficking. Threats of arrest and jail, that's coercion. They weren't paid. They were not allowed to leave. That's a clear case of labor trafficking. Their work conditions were poor, and they had long hours and no days off. And those were the definite red flags of these women being trafficked. And this occurs in domestic work quite a bit. Like I said, it is the #1 industry for trafficking in the nation, and it's also in the top 5 in North Carolina. So other red flags include excessively long hours, monitoring when they leave the house, or always having somebody accompany them, no consistent access to basic necessities, sexual abuse, sexual assault is, again, I can speak to what happened in the stories that I was told in 2014, but the Polaris Project says sexual abuse is a commonality in domestic work for these victims. Physical abuse, and there's no private room, or they may have to sleep in a garage or a basement. So that's a little bit about domestic work. Some top methods of control are financial, withhold their money that they are supposed to be given for their work. The complete misrepresentation of a job, which is what happened to these Indonesian women. Excessive working hours, emotional abuse, always putting the workers down, and their needs or wants denied or withheld. So that's the top 5 methods of control according to the Polaris Project. And that's pretty clear in the case that we have. They did experience fraud. They weren't getting paid. They had excessive hours, excessive working hours, abuse that included the manipulation and the intimidation of their family and friends. And their needs and wants were denied because they did have a disability, and they were required to work very long hours in grueling manual labor positions that they didn't initially agree to. So there are a lot of barriers for domestic workers for reporting their trafficking instances or being trafficked, why domestic workers are more vulnerable to being trafficked. When domestic workers need to seek help or they're seen as invisible. And one of those barriers are the employee-employee relationship that exists in the dynamic. Most domestic workers begin employment through the use of informal channels. So word of mouth, this is a good job, you should do this, and referrals like that, and online. And this creates the likelihood that they have inaccurate information when they accept the position with the employer, and once they accept that position with the employer, it's kind of, the ship kind of sails on that one. Historical factors and social factors also play a role in why domestic workers are more vulnerable to being trafficked. And we can talk about the historical factors let's begin with the history of it. Domestic work was an integral part of slavery in the United States. People in slavery cleaned, cooked, and cared for children. And you'll find later when we talk about rights for farm workers, how this system, the systems that have been set up, are holding over from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So following the abolition of slavery, empowering domestic workers was deemed likely to change the racial dynamics in the country of that area and was not pursued. So giving the domestic workers rights, labor rights, was not pursued at all. Over a century later, the legacy of slavery is still playing out in many ways, both tangible and less so. The exclusion of domestic workers from protections under the U.S. labor laws is an example of a tangible hangover from slavery and the Jim Crow eras, as those laws were purposely crafted to block former slaves from achieving opportunity and power. And we will go more into those laws a little bit later in this presentation, but the history of domestic workers in the U.S., coupled with the fact that most domestic workers are women, immigrants now, and women of color, further increases the vulnerability to exploitative actors. Socially, there is a lack of respect for domestic workers. That lack of respect translates into a society that sees domestic workers as undeserving of protections, which, I mean, we all know that's not true. They absolutely deserve protections, but we have a society set up that doesn't hold domestic workers in high regard. And because of that, the likelihood that they will be trafficked goes up more. The lack of social supports is a vulnerability to being trafficked, hands down. I don't think there's a person that would disagree. If you lack social supports, then the likelihood that you will be trafficked goes up. Finally, because domestic workers work in the privacy of homes, identifying them is pretty hard to do. People who are being trafficked for labor in domestic services are often not even allowed to leave the house. And if they are leaving the house, they're monitored heavily. So the idea of identification becomes more difficult for a general community member or law enforcement or service providers. Does anybody have any questions?
Melinda, there was a question asking if domestic work includes nail salons.
That does not. That's actually, nail salons are actually one of the industries that are that do have labor trafficking though, but it's not included in domestic works. They get their own industry.
So when we're talking about domestic work, we mean housekeepers and nannies primarily, right?
Housekeepers, nannies, people who keep elderly people as well, caregivers, paid caregivers, paid, not unmedically skilled caregivers. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. People that sit with other people that need to be monitored or taken care of constantly. So we're going to go ahead and go into the traveling sales crews. I know you might think that this is an odd industry to be in the top 3 where labor trafficking is prevalent, but these companies that are registered have a little oversight, and when they are caught, nothing typically happens to the companies. I mean, something might happen to the managers in the crew, but, and it's going to be evident in this case here. So this is a very interesting case involving a traveling sales crew. What happened was in August of 2014, police arrested Jeremy Dean Moots, the man on the left, and Justin Agermeyer, and charged them with human trafficking of a child, involuntary servitude, second-degree kidnapping. And when I'm going through all of the charges, because when at the end of this, they were definitely not serving any time for all these charges, and contributing to the delinquency and neglect of a minor. And what happened was 2 teenage girls went missing in Fargo, North Dakota. And Fargo police notified Wilmington police that they may be in the area. The investigation of the Wilmington police led to the travel lodge where these guys were arrested, and the teens said they were held against their will for the purpose of selling magazines. So when we talk about traveling sales crews, it's not just selling magazines, even though that's the majority of what the majority of traveling sales crews, what they're selling, but it's also cleaning products and other publications, and other things like jewelry and stuff. So this is specifically for magazine selling, but it's going to go across the board when we're talking about traveling sales crews and the other things that they're selling. So it doesn't have to be magazines, but this case is magazines. I hope that makes sense. But so what actually happened was the girls had run away from home because they were promised a job that was going to pay so much money. That's really why it's important for everybody to educate young people about what a bogus job ad is and how they see that and what it kind of looks like online, because they found this online. They ran away, and when they got to, well, they were actually in Lumberton first before they went to Wilmington, but they're only being paid $20 a day. And the $20 a day, and this is how traveling sales crews are set up, the $20 a day is their stipend for daily expenses, and they are never really paid money, typically. What happens is the managers keep it in a fund for them, and I'm using air quotes because I want you to know how illegitimate it is. But so managers keep it in a fund for them, and they are not, the likelihood that they'll see the money that they're supposed to be earning is very small. But the suspect had initially told these teens they could go home at any time, and that they would buy the bus tickets for them. But that didn't work out. The teens said they wanted to go home constantly, but they were never allowed to go home. They didn't have any phones. They had phones, but both of their chargers were not broken, so they couldn't communicate, or they couldn't call their parents, and they really wanted to call their parents. Police found 2 18-year-old men from Tennessee who also said that they were being held there against their will at that travel lodge. So Moots was on record in media reports saying he was innocent of these crimes later after he was arrested, and he was doing what the company told him, and that company was Midwest Circulations, LLC. Both of these men would later plead guilty to 2 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a juvenile and received a 120-day sentence in exchange for assistance in an ongoing investigation into what we're assuming is Midwest Circulation. Media reports indicate that anyway. At the time of their plea and sentencing, law enforcement agencies in several states were investigating Midwest Circulations, LLC, a door-to-door magazine sales company. And that's the company that these 2 men were working for as managers. When you look at the way traveling sales crews are set up, it's the manager and then the crews, the manager of the crew, and then the manager and the business typically are the people that make all the money. And these circulation companies are often scams too. So customers report them all the time to the Better Business Bureau for being scammed because they never got the products that they bought. But anyway, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about scams today. I'm talking about labor trafficking. So the DA in this case, Ben David, explained why to the media why they got such light sentences, because due to the complexity of the multi-jurisdictional investigation and prosecution, the New Hanover County DA's office is dismissing the remaining pending charges against the defendants. This is what he said. But there remains a possibility for more charges. The district attorney's office and law enforcement agencies will continue to pursue prosecution of business and individuals that profit from child labor. So I know you're on the edge of your seat wondering what happened to Mid-East Circulation. They're still operating. I don't know of any charges that came from this, any additional charges that came from this case. If you know, please let me know. I could not find any. Their reviews on Indeed, a job board site, was pretty telling. In 2018, which is 4 years after this case, a former employee posted on this job board site and said that Mid-East Circulation was a magazine sales company that only had 40% sales clear rate. Most of the customers didn't receive their subscriptions, and the company shamed that person's name. Plus, they did not purchase sales permits for their representatives. In some areas, you have to have a sales permit if you're a door-to-door salesperson, which got a lot of people on those crews arrested. Now, getting arrested is not, it's financially devastating. And those traveling sales crews, if those people were ever bailed out, which they probably weren't, because traveling sales crews are notorious for abandoning people in dire situations, that's really indicative. And that posting, it was in 2018, and that was 4 years after 2 kids were taken out of the Travelodge for being held against their will and kidnapped and trafficked for labor. But the Circulation Company appears to still be operating, and we're going to go into a lot more about why this can happen, because it absolutely can happen. We have systems set up that allow it to happen, or systems that are set up to it's a low risk crime, especially for businesses. So let's talk a little bit about the red flags. So traveling sales crews frequently move, so it disorients the people that are on the cruise. They don't know where they are or how to get home a lot of the times, so when we talk about abandonment in a moment, it's pretty devastating. These teenagers were held against their will. They were fraudulently told that they were going to make a lot of money, cut off from communication. They're 15 and 16 years old, and they have to stay in a hotel or a motel, which is common in traveling sales crews. So there are some other red flags for traveling sales crews as well. Victims typically provide rehearsed or canned stories about why they're there, and if they're very young, which typically they are, because traveling sales managers and companies target young people. They work long hours and sometimes solicit strangers at weird times because they're trying to make a quota. The reason that they're only making $20 a day as their stipend, if it is $20 a day, some traveling sales crews, it's only $5. And that's what's going to feed them that day. If they're able to make their quota, then maybe they can get paid more, basically. So they are desperate to make a sale, and that is definitely a red flag. Inadequate clothing for the weather, signs of sleep deprivation, poor hygiene, sexual abuse, malnourishment. They act nervous and fearful. They have a real big concern over the quota. So if they don't make their quota, it's either from the worst end that they're abandoned in a desperate situation, or they might be hungry. If they're only given a $5 stipend a day, I mean, what can that do? They are all constantly monitored by cars or vans. So if somebody knocks on your door and there's a van or a car sitting right across the street, and there's a person in that van or car watching them intently, then that is a sign. And abandonment, and I can't stress abandonment enough. When traveling sales crews managers abandon the people that are working for them, it's usually in the middle of nowhere. It's usually a young person, and that leads to more vulnerability to violence, not just trafficking, but violence. They could be harmed, and they're terrified. The idea of getting abandoned in the middle of nowhere is a terrifying prospect for a lot of people in traveling sales crews, and they would do whatever they have to do to not be abandoned by the crew leaders. So Other barriers to crew workers include they take the documents as well. They take IDs or passports or some visas if they, because I think J1 visas are actually common in traveling sales crews. But this is not just foreign nationals, but it's people, domestic foreign people too. They lack financial autonomy because guess who has all their money? The crew leader, the crew manager. Facilitated substance abuse issues, substance addiction. A lot of traveling sales crews, the workers are not paid with money, they're paid with the drugs. And lack of opportunities or assistance outside the crew life. I read some reports that said the traveling sales crews were kind of like a cult. So with that, I'm going to stop for some questions. And if anybody has any, please let me know, or let Pam know, actually.
So I actually do have a question. I actually had to run to the office a few minutes ago. So is there a recording that I can watch this over again?
I do think Pam is recording it, but I don't, Pam?
Yes, there's a recording, and we will send out the recording as well as a PDF of the slides to everyone who registered.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem. So if there are no more questions, we're going to go into the systems that facilitate labor trafficking, and they are pretty complex. First of all, we're going to talk about immigration policies. So we've heard a lot about guest worker visas, the guest worker visa program, and guest worker visas are great. We need people to come and work in this country. Like, we need that. But at the same time, guest worker visas are set up to be kind of exploitative. And according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, most of the people that have been trafficked for labor were here under H2A, H2B, J1, H2, and B1. And you'll find that H2A is for agriculture, H2B, it could be domestic work. J1 was mentioned in traveling sales crews, and B1 is also could also be domestic work as well. So this is a list of what those visas, what industries or what work the visa holders can do. So H2B, temporary non-agricultural workers. H2A, agricultural workers. B1, business visitors, or the purpose business and tourism visitors. So that would be the domestic workers. And J1 is participants of cultural and educational exchange programs. Now, traveling sales crews typically target young people, okay? And if young people need work, then, and they are here for educational purposes, they would be under the J1 visa program. So, oh, that's there again. So work visas are absolutely a legal way for immigrants to enter the country. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have work visas. I'm saying we need to really look at how we have those guest worker visa programs kind of set up. So visa holders may work with an employer who requested, I'm so sorry, an employer who obtained and requested them for their immigration status to remain valid. So they have to work with that employer that holds their visa. That guest worker, should they decide to leave, will become undocumented. So the guest worker cannot see work with anyone else. So if they're in an abusive situation, like the H2A guest worker visas that receive that settlement that I was talking about earlier, they can't leave, or then they become undocumented. And if they become undocumented, they are more likely to be trafficked, and the polyvictimization, the likelihood of more polyvictimization skyrockets. Once a guest worker becomes undocumented, they're gonna either endure, they're likely to be trafficked again, or they're more likely to endure exploitative work practices. So we want to just really look at these immigration policies and see like how we can better, how they could be fixed to not be inherently exploitative. Because a H2A visa holder employer could be the greatest person ever, you know. Some H2A guest worker, H2A, H2B really love their employment, but it's really the ones that have that H2, have that visa program as an employer who are exploitative and are just trying to make money off of the labor of other people, that we need to look at a little bit more, and how can we build that system, keep the system, but build it a little bit better. Like, what do we need to do to change it to make these guest worker programs less exploitative? So there's little oversight and protection, really, when you're looking at this. So the Department of Labor oversees the migrant farm workers' living conditions. And because we're talking about agriculture, we'll talk about that. But there aren't enough inspectors. From the last time I checked, I think there were only 2 Department of Labor inspectors for the state. Pam, do you remember if there are just 2? I think there are only 2, but I'm not sure. Again, that was a long time ago. And ma'am?
That's the last number I heard.
Okay. And it relies on complaint investigation they rely on complaints to start an investigation typically. Who's going to complain to the Department of Labor? I mean, if these workers are already being threatened and they're already scared, the likelihood that they're going to make a complaint is pretty small. There are outreach workers that do go to farm camps in North Carolina anyway, and they're amazing and provide great resources. But I think that if we improved the oversight of the guest worker visa program, things would be a little bit different. And this has the United States Department of Labor, but it's the State Department of Labor too, so they can do their inspections as well. But the guest worker program is under the USDOL. So now we're going to talk about domestic workers a little bit. And when we talk about domestic workers a little bit, we're also going to talk about how our laws are not set up to help them very much. So the National Labor Relations Act, which protects employees' rights to organize for better conditions and bargain collectively, explicitly excludes domestic workers. And the wording around that is in domestic service of any family or person at a home. So and they're not included in the Family Medical Leave Act either, by the way. This is not on the slide, but I wanted to let you know. The history of the Fair Labor, and there is a kind of a silver lining on the Fair Labor Standards Act, and I'm going to go into that. The history of the Fair Labor Standards Act is also an example of how racism has played a large role in the development of our systems. The original FLCA in 1938 did not include domestic workers at all, or in fact, it didn't include agricultural workers. And the purpose behind that was a key compromise to secure Southern Democrats in Congress. But if you go forward a little bit more, one of the original demands of the 1963 March on Washington was to broaden the FLSA to include all areas of employment that are already excluded. Now, so in that did change a little bit. In 2007, a worker challenged the scope of the exceptions when you're talking about domestic work, arguing that because she was paid by a third-party agency, she was entitled to minimum wages. So, because the Fair Labor Standards Act also has minimum wage requirements and overtime pay requirements. So with that challenge, the court ruled and it made clear to the Department of Labor that domestic workers could be considered under the FLCA standards under the discretion of the DOL. So that would include, but it doesn't, the term companionship services will now only include non-professional services. You see what I'm saying? And that's changed over time. Agriculture workers are now also included in the Fair Labor Standards Act. Many domestic workers really still are not afforded overtime pay, though, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and still are excluded. And traveling sales crews are excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act as well. They're explicitly excluded. If we want to jump back to the traveling sales crews, the business model is oppressive and exploitative, as with other forms of labor trafficking. It's a relatively low risk and high profit crime, like we talked about earlier, with the bulk of the profit going to managers. And a lot of that is because there's no oversight in the actual business of traveling sales crews. And that's important. It's important that we look at that when we're looking at protection, labor protections, is my point. And then, so Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits employment discrimination, does not include employers with fewer than 15 employees. So how many homes have 15 employees? So that basically excludes domestic workers, because domestic workers rarely work for employers that have more than 15 employees. With that, I'm gonna open it up for some questions if you have any.
Melinda, we are very blessed to have Nancy Hagan with us, who who knows, as you know, quite a bit about particularly farm labor in North Carolina. And she said that there are 6 housing inspectors.
There's 6 now. Okay. The last time I knew it was only 2. Thank you, Nancy.
Yes. And someone else asked a question. She said, did I hear correct that domestic labor trafficking is #1 in NC?
No, it's #1 in the nation. #1 in NC is agriculture. But it is domestic work is in the top 5 in North Carolina, according to the latest numbers from the human trafficking hotline.
That's all the questions we had.
Okay, wonderful. And now we're going to go to the traveling sales crews, because I know I kind of meandered toward the traveling sales crews while I was talking about domestic workers. But so that basic operational model of traveling sales crews has not changed significantly since the 1970s. The crew sizes are typically between 10 and 40 people, but it could be as many as 100. Crew members are supervised by direct managers, which were the 2 men that were arrested in the case earlier. And those managers are in charge of acquiring housing for the nights, making disciplinary actions, and moving members from city to city every few weeks. Managers are also responsible for running morning and nightly crew meetings, which often lead to making these crews like kind of cultish, according to some survivors. And that can make working hours between 10 and 12 hours after you add in the meetings. Long days on the road are a serious danger for traveling sales crews. So those traveling sales crews leads to it, because of the long hours, it leads to inattention and exhaustion. And others may drive on expired or revoked license. So there's very little oversight and protection for people in a traveling sales crew. And the risks have led to serious crashes in previous years. One in Wisconsin that led to a Wisconsin law called Melinda's Law, spelled with an M-A, not M-E. But the man who spearheaded that law lost his daughter in a wreck, and she was in the traveling sales crew. And that law has been really heralded across the nation as a law that all states should really pass. It's also important to note that outdoor salespeople are not afforded any protection under the Fair Labor Standards Act. They're considered contract employees. And that provides, and because you're considered a contract employee, you're not protected under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for employees against discrimination and stuff and things like that. The independent contractor status of these salespeople really limits their ability to be protected under laws. And also, frequent movement across state lines restricts state investigations. Like we mentioned earlier with Midwest circulation, I'm assuming that investigation fell through because it was across state lines. I mean, we're talking about all the way in North Dakota that they're recruiting people. So, and then they come down to North Carolina, and they were originally in Lumberton, and when the Lumberton police started investigating them, they moved to Wilmington. So the frequent shifts hinder investigations a lot. And companies can easily change their name to maintain operations once they've been identified as abusive. You don't even have to change your name. Sometimes you could just be Midwest Circulation and still be operating today. So what can we do? Like, I don't want to leave you hopeless here. There is so much we can do as people. But first, I want to encourage you to, if you have any kind of suspicions of labor trafficking, and all the red flags that we talked about are also red flags of all labor trafficking in many other industries as well. So you can always call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888. We encourage you to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline because these instances will be investigated as human trafficking. That is the best number for you to call, and they will respond in a way through the lens of human trafficking, not through law enforcement, but through victim services. So what you also can do if you want to take it a step further is you can use your voice. Companies don't change until consumers demand it. I mean, that is pretty clear. And when you want to look at consumers demanding it, all you have to do is look at the coalition of Immokalee workers. They organized so well in Florida that they were able to have their fair food program, their fair food campaign, and signed up 14 big industries to the fair food program, where those retailers are guaranteeing that their tomatoes aren't made off exploitative labor. The Immokalee workers are amazing in community organizing and have made so much progress, and they did that by putting money on the line for companies, because that's what it takes. They did an amazing job of that, and they're still working. Like right now, they are doing a boycott for boycotting Wendy's, and that they hope that Wendy's will eventually sign on to the Fair Food Program, so the tomatoes that are grown and the produce that are grown aren't used at Wendy's aren't grown by exploited people. So that's really really great. And you can also buy fair trade products. Fair trade certification guarantees that people are not exploited for labor. It guarantees that there are no child workers. It guarantees that these people are making a fair and living wage. This is why North Carolina Stop Human Trafficking sells fair trade. It is a human trafficking deterrent. If consumers demand more fair trade products, then companies follow suit. We can say so much with how we spend our money, and that is very important to remember. And also, if you want to talk about it, let's talk about bystander intervention, really, because if you see that there's something wrong, or if somebody is saying that it's okay to, exploit other people for labor, or treat a domestic worker badly, or treat a farm worker badly, or anything like that, if there are other people come forward and say that's not right, then we can change a culture that's accepted this kind of exploitation and this kind of abuse of people. And I'm not sure if this is going to have this is from the Immokalee workers, and Pam doesn't know I put this in here, but I did it last minute. But this is how they are boycotting Wendy's, and the way they're doing it is just so amazing. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear it, but there is subtitles, so So that is how the Immokalee workers are doing it, and I'm just always so impressed with that organization. They've made some great strides in being an effective organization for farm workers. So they're working on Wendy's now, but they've gotten, when you're talking about tomatoes specifically, they've gotten Walmart signed on and 13 other companies. So that's pretty impressive. So, and also another good example of how your voice can actually change things. The story that I told you about in 2014 when I met those agricultural workers, the reason I was called out as a journalist to go do this kind of outreach with the Farm Labor Organization Committee was because British parliamentarians had come into the tiny Dudley. I don't know if you know how tiny Dudley is, but it's very tiny, to talk to these farm workers. These British parliamentarians went back to the UK and called for change for British Tobacco Company. I mean, that's how, and the Farm Labor Organization Committee in Dudley anyway was run by volunteers and interns, and I think one paid employee. So the voice of people really matter, and the voice of those workers were heard. It didn't get published in the paper at the paper I was working at. And that's because of that confusion around labor trafficking. I got comments from my editors that said they knew what they signed up for. That was horrible, but that's what I've heard. I heard they knew what they signed up for, and it was this was an attack on farmers, which it's not. There was no attacking in it. It was just the truth, but it's so confusing and so it was so not understood among people in the EVA area that no media outlets covered it. But British parliamentarians went back to the UK and brought it forward in their government. So I think that we can definitely do things. So what else you can do is you can write to your elected officials. If any kind of policy in this presentation had moved you in any way, you should write Congress and tell them. Ask the state legislators to pass their own Melinda's Law around traveling sales crew safety. And you can also ask Congress to add domestic workers to the list of worker protection laws that they may be excluded from. So your voice is very, very important. And with that, I'm going to give us a little bit of time, about 12 minutes for questions.
So Melinda, we have a question. Do these workers know about the rights that they have, primarily undocumented LEP workers?
So the Farm Workers Unit, the North Carolina Legal Aid, the Legal Aid of North Carolina Farm Workers Unit tries to do their best to get them to do the Know Your Rights seminars, and Amex Can here in Pitt County does the Know Your Rights seminars for those agricultural workers. I don't know if they actually, how many do actually know their rights. I would venture to say that it would not hurt to do more of those, honestly. The people that I met didn't.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. The other question was, when you were showing the protest from the Immokalee workers, they asked, where is this taking place?
That was in New York City.
Cool. I am not seeing any other questions. Come on, y'all, take advantage while we're here. Or if you've got comments about, you know, having worked with labor trafficking victims in your own area.
Oh, yes, I would love to hear some comments about the things that you know, because of course, like, that would be wonderful. Learning from you would be great.
And
how about peddling rings are very, I saw Maria's question pop up. Peddling rings and traveling sales crews operate in very much the same way. Peddling rings, like the red flags, are kind of the same. But peddling rings mostly I don't think they're selling anything, they're asking for money. But they do operate in a similar fashion as traveling sales crews, except I don't believe that there are any companies running peddling rings, where traveling sales crews have legitimate companies. Well, they're not legitimate, but companies, selling like subscriptions or cleaning products and things like that. Did that answer your question?
And just since we have an extra minute here, I'd like to mention, I really appreciated the comments that Melinda made about fair trade, and that she showed, the logos. So you all can actually look for those logos when you're shopping. And something I always like to tell people, because I have so many people say, oh, they don't have those in my grocery store. They do. They probably do, but you just haven't known to look for those logos. Melinda and I both live in a little bitty town called Farmville, North Carolina.
Very tiny.
Population 4,800. And the Food Line in Farmville has a lot of fair trade products. They have coffee and tea, sugar, chocolate. There's cereals that have fair trade certification. And of course, my own personal favorite and my excuse for eating ice cream, Ben & Jerry's.
Ooh, yeah.
Fair trade. So, I say that to say, start looking for those little logos, and you can, eat your chocolate and your ice cream guilt-free, because you can say, oh, I'm doing it for a good cause. I am preventing human trafficking.
I see Francisco's got a question about cruise ships that fit the description of those who are trafficked. I really couldn't answer that very intelligently. I haven't ever considered cruise ships. But I do know hotel workers. The industry, the hotel industry does labor trafficking with their employees from time to time. But I don't know much about crew members. I can check though. And I'm going to write that down and see if I can find any information for you, Francisco.
I wonder if perhaps and I don't know anything about cruise ships either. I wonder if they are being hired, by labor contractors to work a particular cruise, then it's quite possible.
That's a good question. I think that labor contractors are really the kind of crux in a lot of labor trafficking cases.
Does anybody else have any question or comments? Oh, so Francisco was a crew member. Okay.
Oh, hey. That is interesting, Francisco. You should email me about it.
I am going to unmute you, Francisco. You want to tell us about it? Oh, where'd you go? Well,
he's at the doctor's office, Pam.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Any other comments? Listen, guys, don't leave me yet. I want to post the post survey. I'm going to go ahead and post both the pre and the post in case you didn't get a chance to do the pre. Please, this will be a huge help to us if you will fill this out. And if for some reason, if you've got another meeting and you absolutely have to leave us now, we will put these links in our follow-up email that's going to have the recording and also the PDFs of the slide.
And in the post test, if you would actually, because this is the first time that we've done this presentation and we want to make sure it's the best possible presentation we can do, please be sure to fill in the comments on the last survey about like what you liked and what you didn't like. Don't worry about, I mean, I know I'm adorable, but don't worry about my feelings because we really do need to know how we can improve.
Right. I'm going to mute myself, but I'm going to leave the chat box open so that you all can, complete the survey. And feel free to chat amongst yourselves. I see Valerie says that Royal Caribbean has faced accusations of slave labor. So Melinda, we need to come to this. I had not heard anything about that.
I'm going to look into that because I had not even thought about it, honestly. That is very interesting to me. I will look into that. And what I find, I'll email you guys in the follow-up if that's okay.
That is awesome.
Ruby, I see your comment here. Can you tell me a little bit about what cities that they are in? Because I know the Immokalis originated in Florida. Are those workers? And that does happen in North Carolina as well, where people who have substance use issues or developmental disabilities, delayed developmental abilities, are trafficked for labor. As a matter of fact, you know, in South Carolina, a man was trafficked for labor in a restaurant, and he had some disabilities as well. And that was pretty recent. I think it was in 2018. And the person who was the restaurant manager, the man was living in the restaurant, was charged and I believe later convicted. He pled guilty. They are very vulnerable populations, as well as homeless shelters. I think sometimes traveling sales crew go to really impoverished people and offer them an opportunity at employment. Thank you, Maria. I miss seeing you in person. So don't forget to do these surveys, please. Wow, Valerie. Do you know what the industry he was made to work in was?
We need to respond to Debbie Miller, you know, asking how should one respond to someone coming to your home. You know, by the time you call the human trafficking hotline, of course, that they're going to be gone. So your best bet, I mean, you can call them just so they'll have the data, but you probably need to call your local law enforcement. And, you know, any information that you can get, like, you know, the description of the vehicle, if you could get a license plate, if by any chance you could get a description of the, you know, the driver, that kind of information would be really helpful. Of course, do not do that in a way that would put yourself in any kind of danger or, you know, in an obvious way, but that could be helpful information.
And a lot of the traveling sales crews are the door-to-door salespeople that they're very young. Like when we talked about the 15 and 16-year-olds, that's actually the target population for recruiting and traveling sales crews. So,
somebody else. Okay.
Yeah. I just
Oh, you do?
the door is so heavy.
Oh.
Back to my room. Yeah. Turn go straight to the right. That's the one.
Nancy, I made a note of your comment. I'm gonna look into that as well, because I certainly don't know. I didn't know that.
All right. Did you want some more Coke?
Yeah, that would be great. Oh. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay. I will grab some.
That's a good concern to have about putting them at a greater risk as well. I think if you report it to law enforcement, it would be important that you let them know that you think that they are victims of labor trafficking when you make that report, so the enforcement officers know. So they don't get arrested for peddling or something without a permit, because a lot of traveling sales crews won't give the workers the permits, and then they'll get arrested, and then they'll be left in jail. Thank you, Valerie. Did you happen to answer, Valerie, the question about what industry that man was in? Crystal, yeah. There was actually a case in Cumberland County of a church it was actually a church who labor trafficked children in a fish market. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was a whole congregation trafficking kids. So they weren't posing as a congregation there, they actually were. So we're going to actually go ahead and close out this meeting. It's 3:32 and it's time. So if you haven't done the pre-survey, by all means, post-survey, please do that when we send out our follow-up email. And thank you for coming. It was great talking to you all. And if you want to email me, you can just email me at melinda@nc.stophumantrafficking.org. Thank you.